Thank you. You may be seated. Our series for the next 2 weeks is just basically on stewardship and other things. Today, my sermon title is The Dishonest Steward, or I like to refer to it as the J.R. Ewing of the New Testament. Glad some of you remember who J.R. Ewing was. Luke's Gospel, 16th chapter. Be reading verses 1 through 9. Jesus told his disciples, there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer. The manager said to himself, what shall I do now? My master is taking away my job, and I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. So he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first, how much do you owe my master? 800 gallons of olive oil, he replied. The manager told him, take your bill, sit down quickly, make it for 400. Then he asked the second, how much do you owe? 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, take your bill and make it 800. The master commended the dishonest manager because he acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcome in eternal dwellings. All right. What do we do with this character? My goodness, the Gospel of Luke is the only one to record the story of this devious and dishonest steward who was commended in spite of his highly questionable behavior. Added to the story itself are several verses which suggest different possible interpretations of the parable's meaning. On the surface, the story is, I think, pretty plain. The manager, the steward of a large farming operation, was charged with wasting his owner's goods. Dismissed without a trial and without any opportunity to defend himself, physically he was unable to do any labor, and dreading the public embarrassment of begging, he acts shrewdly to plan his future. So the situation of the steward and the debtors represents a fairly common picture of the time of Jesus, because people often had to borrow in order to meet taxes or purchase seed for planting, or they had to purchase goods and pay for them later. Whatever the exact nature of the debt is in this case, the steward hands the unpaid bills back to the debtors to be altered in their favor. In the first case, remember, the debt is reduced from 800 gallons of oil to 400. And in the second, a debt of 1,000 bushels of wheat is reduced by 20%. And in this way, you see, the steward makes friends who will owe him a favor when he's turned out in his present position. Scholars do not agree on whether he is simply canceling the excessive interest that he had added on to the original debt, or whether he was actually robbing his employer of money that was owed to him. In either case, he is acting shrewdly to make the most of a difficult situation and to provide for his future. So while it's difficult for us to enter into the spirit of first century economic practices, it's not difficult for us to identify with the dynamics of this story. Wheeling and dealing in the business world is something we are all familiar with, and we've all experienced it. Many of us know and probably admire men and women of the world of business and finance, persons who are always thinking and planning and making the most of their resources in order to turn a profit. Some are astute enough to know how to succeed within the limits of the law, and others clever enough to avoid being caught, I guess. In either case, they are familiar figures to us in our modern economic environment. So in order to experience the impact of this parable, we need to identify with them, or to at least observe them carefully. Now, Jesus, the parable of the prodigal son, which is in Luke 15, ranks near the top of the all-time favorites. I mean, it's been told and retold down through the ages. In contrast, this parable that immediately follows the prodigal son takes the prize of being the most ignored. It's very unpopular. Now, Eugene Peterson, if you probably don't know who he is, but maybe some of you have his Bible at home. He's the one that has been responsible for the newest, one of the new versions, the Message, which I have in my home, and I like the Message. I like it a lot. Well, Eugene Peterson is the man responsible for that. He tells the story on himself. He says, I was approaching Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore looking for a parking place. And I was a preacher going to visit a church member who had recently had surgery. The street was lined with parked cars. I circled the hospital 3 times. No parking place opened up. And I remember that I had friends who, when they're in situations like this, always prayed for a spot. And so I thought, okay, I'll give it a try. I prayed for a parking space. 20 feet ahead of me, a car pulled out. I parked my car. I locked my car. I was so pleased. Not only had I experienced a minor miracle on the streets of East Baltimore, but I also had a story that I could tell my friends now, certifying me as one of the all-time prayers of the world, you know. After my visit with my friend in the hospital, I took the elevator down. I returned to the street, reminiscing on the good fortune of that parking place and the anticipation of telling my friends this story, only to realize that I had locked the keys in the car. We've all probably done that, if we would be truthful. I stood there helpless, looking at my keys dangling from the ignition within the locked car. I was stumped. I had my hands in my pockets. I was wondering what I'm going to do. Just then, a young boy, an African American, about 10 years of age, came up to me and said, "Something wrong, mister?" I said, "Yes, I locked my keys in my car." He said, "I can help you." And he took a piece of wire out of his pocket, and in 30 seconds or less, he had opened the door, reached in, and handed me my keys. I said, "I'm sure glad that I was here when you showed up." And he grinned and he said, "Is it worth $1 to you?" I reached in my wallet. I said, $1, it's worth $2. And I handed him the money. And as I drove away, the parable in Luke 16 that has puzzled and even scandalized so many, a rascal commended for being a rascal, surfaced and came to the forefront of my mind. Wasn't this what I had just experienced? This street boy of Baltimore's inner city at 10 years of age, an old pro at entering locked cars and asking for whatever he could pick up for spending money, using his skill at picking locks to stay alive in his environment, and now praised by me for employing his questionable expertise in creative survival. That's what this parable basically is about. And really what they're trying to say is, if only the disciples were as eager and ingenious in their attempts to attain goodness as people of the world are in their attempts to gain money. If only there was more men and women who would show as much practical sense in God's business as worldlings do in theirs. Or as John Calvin said in commenting on this parable, how stupid it is to want to interpret it in every detail. Christ simply meant that the children of this world are more diligent in their concern for their own fleeting interests than the sons of light for their eternal well-being. The parable is clearly a call for those who care about and long for the reign of God in their lives to use every possible resource in eagerly planning and preparing for its coming. The rascal emerges as a metaphor for the surprising improbability of grace. Not unlike the 10-year-old on that East Baltimore street, this is not a story of Jesus commending a crook for being a very clever crook. Instead, this is a story of salvation. The kind of story that is at the very core of Jesus' good news. And that's great. But this series we're doing for the next 2 weeks is about stewardship. It's about finance and money. And what we need to focus on is one word here, and that word is wisdom, from verse 8. The NIV says shrewd, a negative meaning. The King James Version says, and the Lord commended the unjust steward because he had done wisely. For the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. So let's define those two groups. You might be confused. The children of the world are those whose focus in life does not include God. The children of light are those who follow Jesus, the light of the world. And the problem lies in the fact that sometimes God's people tend to be naive. But as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves, Matthew says, this is the call to perspective, to be street smart. But don't sin. You don't want to sin. This parable issues a challenge for us to wise up. Pray for wisdom. Work at wisdom. And sometimes wisdom comes with age, and sometimes age comes along. And the reason age sometimes comes along is that we fail to work at being wiser. We just expect it to happen, you know. Most skills are developed through disciplined practice, so we need to work at being wise. And how do we do that? Read the Bible and other Christ-centered books on many topics. Analyze our mistakes so that we don't repeat them. Visit with wise people. Ask questions so we can learn from their experiences. Listen more than we talk. Don't assume we have all the answers. Explore both sides of any argument. Seek first to understand before we seek to be understood. Be tenacious. Wisdom is often gained through trial and error. Don't be afraid to fail. grow in wisdom. Now, occasionally the Lord gives amazing wisdom as a gift, but mostly He teaches it through life. The school of hard knocks takes longer, but produces lasting results. Even Jesus had to grow in wisdom. Remember in Luke, and the child grew and became strong. He was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. Also in Luke, and Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and men. And then we get to verse 9, and many of us get sidetracked by comparing what a Christian ought to do with what this dishonest manager did. Now notice that Jesus never said we should imitate the actions of that guy. In the parable, he is commended for being smart by the standards of his day. He used what resources had been given to him to prepare for the future. His actions were, as one dictionary defined it, marked by clever discerning awareness, or shrewd. Now, we must not be guilty of the same actions, but we should be guided by similar perspectives of life and attitude. Are our decisions about how we behave and what we do with our wealth we have been given, is it marked by clever discerning awareness? The fact is, every one of us someday will find that our money cannot help us or defend us. The day will come when we will stand before God, stripped of all the things in which we put our confidence here on earth. And in that moment, perhaps, someone whom we have helped along the way with money will step forward and kind of testify for us. And on this level, the parable forces us to think of ways that we can spend our money to enhance the life of others, rather than spending it on our own comfort and our own security. Astute planning for our future with God must include the compassionate use of our money and possessions in meeting the needs of others. True discernment will show us that the one relationship that matters more than all the others, beloved, is our relationship with the Lord. Invest our energies in building up that relationship. Only the Lord can give us eternal home in the kingdom of heaven. But realize, too, that the way we behave toward others impacts the growth of that relationship with God and vice versa. When we connect with the Lord first, then we are in a position to connect with others in a genuine way. True friendship can't be bought. It can only be built. Speaker Bob Perks was at an airport when he overheard a father and daughter in their last moments together. And they had announced her departure, and standing near the security gate, they hugged each other. And he said, "I love you. I wish you enough." She in turn said, "Daddy, our life together has been more than enough. Your love is all I ever needed. I wish you enough too, Daddy." And they kissed, and she left. And he walked over toward the window where I was seated, and standing there, I could see that he wanted and needed to cry. I tried not to intrude on his privacy. But he welcomed me in by asking, "Did you ever say goodbye to someone knowing it would be forever?" "Yes, I have," I replied. Saying that brought back memories I had of expressing my love and appreciation for my dad and what he had done for me. Recognizing that his days were limited, I took the time to tell him face to face how much he meant to me. So I knew what this man was experiencing. Forgive me for asking, but why is this a forever goodbye? And he said, I'm old, and she lives much too far away. I have challenges ahead, and the reality is the next trip back here will be for my funeral, he said. Well, when you were saying goodbye, I heard you say, I wish you enough. May I ask what that means? And he began to smile. He said, that's a wish that has been handed down through other generations. My parents used to say it to everyone. And he paused for a moment and looking up as if trying, to remember it in detail, he smiled even more. And when he said, when we said we wish you enough, we were wanting the other person to have a life filled with just enough good things to sustain them. And then, turning toward me, he shared the following, as if he was reciting it from memory. I wish you enough sun to keep your attitude bright. I wish you enough rain to appreciate the sun more. I wish you enough happiness to keep your spirit alive. I wish you enough pain so that the smallest joys in life appear much bigger. I wish you enough gain to satisfy your wanting. I wish you enough loss to appreciate all that you possess. I wish you enough hellos to get you through the final goodbye. And then he began to sob and walk away. And that brings me to my last thought. It's a good story, kind of a humorous story. It's about a story of a missionary who was sitting in her second floor window reading a letter from home. And in it was a crisp $10 bill. And she was pleasantly surprised. But as she read the letter, her eyes were detracted by the movement of a shabbily dressed man down below, leaning against a post in front of her building. She couldn't get him off her mind. Thinking that he might be in greater need than herself, she penned the words, "Don't despair," on an envelope and threw it out the window with the $10 bill in it. The stranger below picked it up, read the note, tipped his hat in gratitude, and then walked away. The next day, she was about to leave the house when there was a knock at the door. The same man from yesterday handed her a roll of bills. She asked what they were for, and he replied, "That's $100 you won, lady. Don't despair, paid 5-1. I like that. I like that. Obviously, an act of love, service, and giving doesn't always have a 5-1 payoff. Sometimes it's much more. Why not take the next step in your life to receive the financial freedom God wants for you and to see how God will bless you in your life and what greater opportunities in His kingdom He will entrust in you. And oh, beloved, all of my 8 o'clock family, please, how I wish you enough. Amen.